All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. Today, I am joined by Christia Spears Brown, author of Unraveling Bias, How Prejudice Has Shaped Children for Generations and Why It's Time to Break the Cycle. Christia Spears Brown, PhD, is a professor of developmental psychology and the director of the Center for Equality and Social Justice at the University of Kentucky. Her research focuses on children's experiences with ethnic, racial, and gender discrimination and stereotypes, and how racism and sexism impacts the academic, social, and psychological lives of children and teens. In addition to award-winning scientific research articles, chapters, and academic books, and numerous teaching awards, she is the author of Parenting Beyond Pink and Blue: How to Raise Children Free of Gender Stereotypes. She was the 2019 Society for Research in Child Development Scholar in Residence. She regularly speaks with and consults parent groups, schools and teachers, toy and media companies, and businesses about reducing the impact of stereotypes, is regularly featured in international media outlets, cases of gender discrimination in schools. And before we get started, I just wanted to briefly touch on a couple of the other upcoming events at our bookstore. This Saturday, February 12th at 6 p.m., we'll be hosting an in-store book signing with Sarah Langston to celebrate the release of her book, Ogden, the Charles McCarthy Photographs. And then the following Saturday, on February 19th at 6 p.m., we'll be hosting Brooke Staybrook for an in-store book signing to celebrate her books, Tell Me a Tale of Rebirth and Tell Me a Tale of Revenge. We'll be ending tonight's discussion with a 10 to 15-minute audience Q&A. So if you have any questions for Christia, drop them in the YouTube chat box and I'll make sure they get asked. And finally, if you enjoy this conversation, please consider supporting Christia by buying her book, and please consider supporting our bookstore by buying it through us. And I'll leave links where you can do so down below. But yeah, without further ado, let's get started. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I was wondering, could you start off just by telling us a little bit about your background and what led you to write this book?
Sure. So I'm kind of like you said in the intro, I'm a developmental psychologist. And what I study is, as a researcher, is how kids form stereotypes and how they understand discrimination when they start being affected by it and how it impacts particularly their academic lives, but also their social lives and how they think about themselves. And I've done that research since the late 90s. So things have changed, obviously, as time has changed. And I've become more and more interested in, though, a couple of things. One is talking to people that are actually in the lives of kids. I think as researchers, we often just write our little journal articles and, about 10 people read it. But I'm much more interested in talking to people that are actually like in the trenches with kids, like parents and teachers and people that are making decisions that affect kids' lives. And so that's part of the kind of impetus for it. But also the realization that we keep having these really basic conversations about racism and sexism and homophobia that don't really capture, like, for one, kids are really young when they first start holding stereotypes about others and when they start being affected by others' biases. So it's starting in infancy. We also know that there's like all of these structural biases too that have to be considered at the same time as, we tend to think, oh, that person is racist. We need to, fire them. The system is all so biased and it impacts kids' lives in such entrenched ways. I wanted to have kind of a longer conversation about how individual biases and those structural biases work together to shape kids and how we can try to tease apart all of that stuff. And like, how can we actually start to get in there and undo the, generations of damage we've done.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's one of the things that I really appreciate in this book is that you make it very clear that this must be combated on both a systemic and individual level. Because often, we don't recognize those institutions as inherently biased. So I have a question about, one of the things that you talk about, I believe in like the introduction, kind of the primer to all of this is how parents can carry biases that they themselves don't realize that their children can then pick up on. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that's, partly I think it's relevant because I think most of the people that are going to pick up a book like mine and read it, they're already a pretty unbiased group of parents, right? You're buying a book called Unraveling Bias. You're clearly committed to these issues, to the ideas of equality. And so, but I think the tricky part about bias is it's not as though you have to say something out loud to your kid, right? I think most of the time we think kids only learn biases or like prejudices because their parents say, this group of people is bad, or, black people are like this and white people are like this, or men are like this and women are like this, or something like that. The reality is that doesn't happen very often. Usually it's much more subtle, and it is really well-meaning, well-intentioned parents that have implicit biases, that because we all do, and that those are what are getting passed down to their kids. So implicit biases, I say a lot of times, if you live on the planet for 5 minutes, you're going to form these implicit associations of, when we see television, typically the people portrayed as criminals are either Black or Latino. People that are portrayed as terrorists are typically Muslim. Women are soft and cry, and men are brave and aggressive, right? We've seen those, and we know that kids have seen them by the time they're 5 years old. So we have those associations in our brain, even if we don't believe them in our hearts. So it's the disconnect between what our brain has made connections and patterns, because that's what the world has shown us. And then your heart cannot believe it at all. But your brain really subtly is making those connections that can affect our really subtle behaviors, like the kind of body language we have, or whether we tense up when somebody comes near us, or whether we nod, encouragingly, or look a little bit more surprised. And there's research that shows that very, very young kids can detect those implicit biases, those really subtle nonverbal cues that parents make. And that then shapes kids' own attitudes about those groups. So it's not parents saying, like this group, don't like that group. But if a parent looks a little bit uncomfortable, kids are detecting it and extrapolating and kind of thinking, oh, my parent's uncomfortable, I'm therefore uncomfortable. And then they kind of take it and run with it. And so that's the subtle ways in which those implicit, really subtle things dig in. And if we're not talking about it, if we talk about it with kids, then they get some armor around it. But if we don't, it's just allowed to kind of fester.
Thank you so much. I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit about how you chose to structure the book? I think it's a really great kind of step by step, just builds on itself. You start with this primer and then go into all of this history and all of these court cases, and then kind of bring it into the modern era. I was wondering if you could talk a little about that.
I can say that is thanks to good editors that helped me take this in my head, I knew we have to talk about court cases, because the reality is policies, how our kids go to schools, are determined by laws, which have been shaped by what typically the Supreme Court says. Our white and Black and Latino and Asian kids go to school together because of a court case. Girls are allowed to go to schools with boys and are supposed to be free from harassment because of a court case. Immigrant kids, regardless of documentation, are allowed to go to school because of a court case. So these ways in which kids are treated fairly or unfairly come down to court cases. So I was well, we have to do that. And the reality is we didn't emerge in 2022 with all of the biases we have. When we think about trans students who are excluded from sports teams, that didn't come out of nowhere. We have a long history of these things. Issues about immigrant kids and particularly refugee kids in those cages at the border from a few years ago. That has a long history. And so we can't really understand what's going on now without an appreciation of how we got here. And hopefully we can learn some of those lessons. So partly with the editors and kind of helping me try to figure out how can we lay the structure, it's structural bias. So in the real sense of lay the structure first, and then think about, well, how does that affect people in their day-to-day lives? So kind of you got to establish that part of it first before you can do the other stuff. And the idea is that we have to change them both, right? Like, and I think I found lots of lessons from like the Brown v. Board of Education that desegregated schools in the 50s. You really see that it was because people's attitudes were beginning to change about segregation that the courts were then a little more open to making changes in the laws. And then when the laws changed that allow kids to go to school together, people's attitudes got a little bit better, but then there was also a lot of backlash. So people had to get a little bit more used to it, but then the law had to step in and fix it, make it more refined. And so it's this constant back and forth of changing people's hearts and minds and then changing the laws. And then over time, we move towards justice. And so I think trying to tell that was a challenge. So I'm glad it worked. But trying to say, this isn't meant to be like a history book, but I think oftentimes we try to change how people feel when the reality is the laws that are shaping us, people trying to change the achievement gap between white and Black students, for example, lots of work on that. Well, you also have to learn the history of segregation in America to learn why schools are also currently really differently funded. So kids at predominantly white schools get almost $400 more per year per student than schools with predominantly Black and brown kids. And so when we're talking about achievement gaps, it's not about changing my attitudes or stereotypes. I got to change how schools are funded. Like, it's a basic fundamental thing. So I got to kind of like establish the structures before we can lay on the human factors, which I think are probably easier to change, but sometimes don't change until we change the more foundational stuff.
Yeah, definitely a very complicated process that just, yeah, like you're saying, that kind of give and take of like inching forward. It's so fascinating how each influences the other. Um, I wanted to ask, are there any court cases in particular that you spoke about in your book that stand out to you?
Well, I'll say this: it was an interesting process as when I was writing it, because I'm a developmental psychologist. I'm used to reading studies and kind of those types of things and analyzing the statistics. So digging into the court cases in many ways was a real learning process for me. I mean, a couple of ones that are recent have been really pretty heartbreaking. And one was Gavin Grimm, which just got resolved last year, maybe, in which he's a trans youth, and he was banned from using bathrooms that aligned with his gender identity. And despite having documentation from his doctor, having done all of the kind of medical things that the school said, they wouldn't let him use the bathroom that aligned with his gender identity. And just the heartbreaking reading him talking about it was really sad. And then part of it is there's kind of YouTube videos of his city council the school board meeting where he was like, I'm just a regular boy, I just want to like live my regular life. And so realizing how many adults were causing so much damage to this one kid, and it was really kind of brought on by people from not even in the school. It wasn't really the kids in the school that were complaining. It was these outside adults who started to have an opinion, and just seeing the damage that it caused this kid who really was just trying to like use the restroom, and there weren't options, and it led to urinary tract infections and kidney infections, and he had to have all these kind of medical consequences because of these decisions that the school made. And I think it's one thing to think about segregation in the 1950s, but when you're like, this was like just this past year that this was getting resolved, and so to know that this is our modern day version. So it's like we're not learning these lessons of, if you exclude kids from basic equal treatment, the damage it does not only to them physically, but emotionally, academically. So that one was, I think, really was harsh to read, partly because when I was writing it, the case hadn't even been resolved yet, because Also, I learned that these cases take forever. So this kid was long out of high school, but he kept at it because he's like, I don't want other kids to kind of go through this. So I think that's the real stuff that sticks with you when you realize it happens now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that you do really well with this is humanizing a lot of these ideas that can be somewhat abstract. But yeah, I think it's important for folks to realize that people are impacted by this, and young people, children, and it is heartbreaking.
Yeah, I'll just say one other, like kind of the court case one that stuck with me too, which is I think a more positive one, but it was one of the and the human side of it is I think those like Brown, we've all heard of like Brown v. Board of Education, but what people don't realize is it was like 5 different court cases that were all part of it. And in one of them, it was really started by a girl named Barbara Johns, who was a high school student, and she got fed up with her school. And it was kind of a tar paper, really dilapidated school that wouldn't hold. It was, I think there's, 4 times more students in it than it was built for. They were having classes like in the school bus. There weren't working restrooms. And she got really fed up and decided to stage a boycott. And so she got a little group together and they made signs. They gave themselves a name. And what they did was they lured the principal out of the school. So they called the principal from an outside line and said, there's these kids in downtown, they're causing causing a ruckus. So the principal leaves the school to go see what's going on. While the principal's out of the building, this group of high school kids hold a rally of all of the class, all of the school, and convince them to do a walkout and a protest. And they called this man that was affiliated with the school. It was like the one person they knew that might have some kind of power. He happened to be an attorney, but he was affiliated with the school. That guy happened to know the NAACP attorneys that were in the process of fighting for school desegregation. So he made a call, and this group of well-organized, irritated high school students convinced the NAACP to take on their cases. That was one of the cases in the Brown v. Board of Education. And it was started because of like literally the teenagers decided we're not doing this anymore. And I think about now some of the like Black Lives Matter protests, like there was one in Nashville that was really led by a group of teenagers that really rallied together thousands and thousands of protesters. And so the other part of it was just the like power of these teenagers to get things done. And I think that was also really like an inspiring part of it, is that even in all of the kind of negative part, it's kind of amazing what 17-year-olds can do sometimes. Like for good. I think they often get a bad rap, but I think the kind of power that they can have for social change is also pretty inspiring.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think we're seeing a lot of that right now. A lot of young people who want to take their own future into their own hands. And yeah, it's upsetting that it's something that they have to fight for. But it is inspiring, just like the hope and the passion that these kids have.
Right.
I wanted to ask, what was the research process of this like for you? Because there's quite a lot of sources here. It's
It is. There's a lot of sources. It started, I was writing another book back in 2016 when I kind of got the idea for this one. And luckily I was able to have 3 months where I lived in DC as part of that scholar in residency, and was able to go to the Library of Congress and was able to look at some really old documents from some of these cases, was able to go to Howard University and look at some of the work of some of the Mamie Clark, one of the first kind of scientists that looked at these issues, look at her master's thesis. So you could see these like really old studies that were done, which just was kind of fun for me. And part of it was just sitting there, spending a lot of time writing. It coincided with COVID. So it was also a challenge to do a lot of research when, like many parents. I was parenting through it. And so most of the book was written with kids doing homeschool in the other room while they were doing their remote learning for their schools. They were in one room while I was in the other room. So a lot of it was done that way. But the benefit was I was able to kind of step out of my normal work life and focus on this and kind of dig into a lot of these stories.
Great, thank you. Are there any excerpts from the book that you'd like to share with us?
Let's see. I'll say the other part of it is that, the last part of the book is really what people can do. And so I think that was part of the decision too, was to end it on a positive kind of, you dig into the history part and then think about, well, where do you go from here? I think that's a big part of it. Well, I can just say I can jump and read a little bit from the very end, which is just kind of about what to leave with. Because I think it summarizes a lot of what the book part of it is about. So it just says, looking back at the history of this country and reading about all of the studies documenting how bias affects children at every turn can be overwhelming. Bias is so pervasive, it's difficult to know where to start trying to make things better. Bias is also as diverse as the people it impacts. Sometimes it's face-to-face, sometimes accidental, and sometimes deeply embedded within our laws. Entrenched structural biases and the stereotypes and prejudices held by children and adults interact to funnel Black kids to underfunded schools, to send Black girls to detention for being, quote, disrespectful, and place boys in the pipeline to prison. It allows children to chant, "Build the wall," in the cafeteria, to blame Asian American teens for COVID, to keep refugee children locked in cages away from their parents, to punish a girl for wearing a tank top while ignoring the boy who's sexually harassing her, and to cause transgender youth to develop urinary tract infections because they're afraid to use the bathroom at school. Bias ignores that these are just kids trying to feel safe and loved, trying to learn and make friends, trying to navigate homework and puberty and social media. Most people believe in equal rights and the American dream, but oftentimes that explicit belief in fairness makes it more difficult to change biases within ourselves and our institutions. It's difficult to recognize that you can be a good person who believes in fairness while simultaneously holding biases. But we have to start somewhere. So start with the biases that enrage you the most. Start at home in the small conversations at the dinner table or in the car. Start by going to the library and getting some new books. Then move to a conversation with a neighbor who might be different from you. Have a conversation with your child's teacher about the classroom. Get children involved in activities outside of their comfort zone with new kids. Role play being an upstander for when they see harassment. Then start to look at the bigger picture. Talk to the school librarian about media for the whole school. Look at the upcoming debates in front of the city council. Get informed about policies and advocate for the ones that effectively reduce bias. But don't stop with the biases that most affect the children in your life. We have to collectively work to reduce bias that affecting all children. We also have to care about the kid who seems completely different from our own. Otherwise, we're contributing to the bias. Desmond Tutu said it well. He says, if you're neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. So none of us can say we care about children unless we care about all children, because bias is too entrenched. It will take all of us to unravel it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, I think it's so important to have actionable guidance that people can use, because there is a lot of theory out there that will kind of help you recognize these patterns and unpack it. But yeah, I'm always left wondering, well, what now? Like, what can be done?
Yeah. And I think the last third of the book is really that. So about like, what can you do at home and what can we do like in our schools and communities? And then what can we do just like more broadly as society? And I think partly because it can be overwhelming to dwell in the negative part, but there are a lot of things we can do, really small things and really big things. So I think that that's really the kind of thing I hope people leave with.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you come across anything in like researching or writing this book that surprised you or took you off guard?
Um, well, I'll say, like, as a researcher, I knew, so, like the first part is the kind of the policies and the history part, and the middle part is really the science of how kids are formed bias, and the last part is really what can we do? Like, now what do we do? So the science part of it I knew. I think there were some parts about our history and like how much bias we've done that I was shocked. And I'll say one of them that was the most shocking to me was about immigration. So a lot of, so in the book I talk about race, particularly in terms of like Black African American kids, but also immigrant youth. So particularly focusing on Asian American, Latino, and Middle Eastern kind of Muslim kids. So Muslim's not an immigrant, but in terms of that kind of group, Arab American, and then talk about gender and gender identity, and then sexual orientation. So to give context, but the immigration stuff, the rates at which we have shown bias towards immigrants throughout the history of the U.S. was actually a little surprising to me to see how extreme it had been. To see the mass deportations, for example, in the 50s, deporting millions of people simply because they looked Latino, people that were American citizens, people that were veterans that had fought in World War II, for example, were being deported, people that came to the US as part of worker programs. We put them really in train cars and shipped them into the middle of Mexico and kicked them out. That part of it was actually shocking to me. And because it wasn't in that, it was in the, mid 1900s. And I think we think about immigration in kind of new ways, but we forget that we have this really long history of really dehumanizing immigrants. And so what we see then is a lot of stuff that affects kids now is really just part of a long cycle of it. Just and also the hate crimes that kids now experience. So, a lot of the and the ways in which politics play into all of this too. So when things ramp up in the political sphere, so particularly some of the rhetoric around Donald Trump, when that was happening a lot, the hate crimes that, for example, Mexican immigrant youth were facing, kids being, told, go back to where you come from. There's a video that I watched of kids circling, kind of what I referenced there at the end, circling a 5th grade kid and screaming, build the wall, build the wall. And that level of kind of hatred and harassment and hate crimes that kids and teachers were reporting were happening. So the teachers are reporting seeing these things happening in with them and their students. That was a pretty surprising part to see how pervasive it is. And I think as adults, I think we often think, oh, kids are really protected from a lot of this. But you really see kids, and this was like 2017, having swastikas painted on their lockers. A lot of white nationalism making its way into schools, into modern schools.
And that kind of leads into another thing that I wanted to ask you about. With all of these environmental factors that contribute to biases, how much control do you think that parents ultimately have over whether their children develop biases, especially, in regards to like a lot of white nationalist groups specifically target young people because they're impressionable. Like does the environment, how much of an impact does that have on these kids?
I think parents play actually a huge role. I mean, I think that's the core motivation for why I write this for parents predominantly. I think that so I think that there are explicitly like racist people and they're sometimes parents. And so this really not for those. I think there's a lot of parents though that are well-meaning but are silent on these issues. I think white parents specifically are often uncomfortable talking about race, thinking if I talk about race, I'll make my kids racist. And so they often like to say, and they also think their kids don't notice race. So it's common for parents to say, no, my kids are colorblind, they don't notice this. But what we know from lots of research is kids are not colorblind. I often say that's a medical condition. That's not a racial attitude. We see people's races. We come in different shades. That's not bad to say. And that often for white parents, if they're uncomfortable talking about race, they don't. And so then kids are really left to pick up all of these stereotypes and prejudices that are out there. And so what I encourage and kind of what the research suggests is, for one, for parents to work on their own kind of implicit biases, but that they really have to have conversations with their kids. So teaching them about bias, talking about race and what stereotypes and discrimination are. So helping them become critical consumers of the world as opposed to just kind of passive recipients of it. But other things are helpful too. Things like focusing on teaching kids about empathy and taking others' perspectives. So explicit conversations about empathy, which I think we want all of our kids to have, is helpful to reduce biases. Helping kids have better knowledge about different groups is really helpful too, right? So giving them a lot of exposure to diverse others. We know that one of the best ways to reduce bias is what we call intergroup contact. So having contact with people that are different than you is one of the single best things we can do. And as parents, we're in charge of the context our kids are often in. So it's going to, being in spaces that are as diverse as possible. And if you can't do it in person, Mike, I think Utah is similar to Kentucky. There's a limit to the amount of racial diversity that's there, but that's what's great about media. So the plug for books, what's great about children's literature is they're often picture-based, and there's so many great diverse books out there that feature people, the characters that are different than your child. So it's like both helpful for kids to see themselves represented, but it's also great to see people different than, so for white kids, it's good to see racially diverse people. If they can't have it in real life, they can have it in media, particularly books. For boys, it's good to see books with girls as the main character, to see that girls can carry a narrative. For kids of color, it's good to see themselves represented. For cisgendered kids with a kind of typical gender identity, it's good to see gender diverse kids. And then for gender diverse kids, it's good to see gender diverse kids. So I think that being able to see that. So, I've talked a lot in the book about inclusive media, because I think that it's more important than we realize. There's a reason that kids have the same stereotypes across the country, wherever they live, because the media we consume shapes our biases. And the flip side of that is inclusive media, especially in the absence of having it face to face, can also really provide opportunities to see a world that's diverse. So you're then comfortable with a world that's diverse. And that's really the best way to reduce biases. So I think parents have a huge role, just in the house. There's other things parents can do too, but I think just even those small things, those micro conversations, when you see an example of bias in the car, if you're driving and hear something on the radio, have a 2-minute conversation about it. And helping kids be critical and empathetic and comfortable with difference is, I think, some of the big ones.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And that makes a lot of sense that, having conversations with your children would help with this, because I think most of us, I at least was raised not really having these conversations with my parents. So I ended up having to kind of unlearn a lot of things by myself later on.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it makes sense to just approach that as it comes up. And I also liked how you talked about how media representation matters. Like, I think that's something that we hear a lot, but it's not just like a buzzword. Like, one of the things that you talk about in your intro is, am I remembering correctly that at 3 months, children are able to like put people into racial categories?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
You,
biological. It's wild. Like
yeah. I mean, I think we are hardwired to put people into categories. So we're good at birth, putting people into race groups and gender groups. So that part seems to be, I think it's just kind of our brain needs to categorize things. We also categorize, you know, cars versus trucks and dogs and cats. Apples and oranges. Like we're born categorizers because it helps simplify a really complicated, complex world. So we need to chunk it to make it easier to process. And so we seem to do that with humans like we do with everything else. And we are really good at detecting patterns. So, in the same way that we each learned languages without someone having to sit down and tell us a noun goes here, a verb goes here. As a baby, you just start to notice patterns. It's what helps us be so smart. The problem is we also pick up patterns of this person always looks like they're doing this. This person always looks like they're doing this. So we also make patterns with people, and those are stereotypes. So we seem to be hardwired to do that. The problem is we then have all these other like inequalities built on it. And also people are much more complicated than apples and oranges, and dogs and cats, right? And so that's what probably is a fine human tendency gets turned on its head, and leads to problems. But that's also partly why it's hard to change, because some of it we seem to be doing. So that's why it's like helping kids recognize individual differences, helping kids understand the inequality part of it and why. So they're not saying, well, men are just naturally better leaders. Because what we see is like kids look at who all's been presidents in the United States, and kids know it's been all men. And their explanation is because men are better leaders, or because it's against the law for women to be president. So in elementary school, because if you're a kid, like that's a pretty common sense answer. Either they must just be better at it, or there must be some rule, because we have all these presidents and they're all men. So there must be a rule, because kids live in a world where rules determine everything, right? You walk in a single file line down the cafeteria, you sit in a certain spot, like rules determine their lives. And so what we realize is that parents don't talk about it. And so therefore kids are left to explain the patterns on their own. And I'm quite certain none of us want our daughters thinking that men are presidents because men are better leaders, right? But in the absence of us having explicit conversations about inequalities and biases and the ways in which these things have developed, kids kind of run with their own explanations. And that's usually when we get into trouble when it comes to biases.
hey, thank you. What were the most difficult and the most rewarding aspects of writing this book for you?
The most difficult was, I think you captured it in that it's a lot of different kinds of information and thinking about how do I structure and tell it in a way that's not overwhelming or boring, and getting it too far in the weeds of something, and doing it in a way that has some kind of structure that makes sense, because it is a lot. And so trying to tell that in a way that didn't confuse people was the challenge, for sure. That was for sure. The other challenge, honestly, was I was also writing it. So I was writing it over COVID. And it was also when things like George Floyd was murdered. And trans bills were coming up left and right to ban trans kids from sports teams. So it was also tough, like just emotionally, to be writing stuff and then just to see it playing out kind of constantly. And so that part was a challenge. And also, frankly, just it was hard to write a book over COVID without having my kids go away to school. Having a kid that talks a lot and you're like, oh, wait a minute, I just had a thought, and trying to like juggle, which is a very real part of it. The rewarding part was I really learned a lot. I think that's one of the things that's most enjoyable is how much I learned. Um, and that's always a fun part of it, is to expand my own understanding of things, and to write things and think, wow, I can't believe this is the way it is. That part of it was the fun part, because I feel like I got a much better handle on things. I was often shaking my head at things we've done. But then reading these inspiring stories, that was also a fun part of it. And so I think that, so hopefully other people learn a lot, because I know I learned a lot as I was writing it, in fact.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've learned a lot from what I've read so far, certainly, and I think folks have a lot to learn from this book. While you were writing it, were there any books, texts, people in particular that inspired you?
Um, yeah, I mean, a lot of them. Um, and I'll say this, it's a little bit of a different answer, but what was really inspiring to me was, so one of the things I did was I wanted to kind of hold space for the people that did this early research on these topics. So for all of this, so I describe a lot of kind of science of and like studies, and that all came also out of a time and a place. So the kinds of research questions and the understanding we have of kids is because certain science, like social scientists, ask the questions, and they are also products of their time and their place. And so I tried to and interestingly, the people that study bias are often people that are in marginalized groups themselves, because they're the ones that are really aware of the damage this stuff does. And so that's often who the researchers are. But that also means that they really didn't get the credit that I think they deserved because of the same silencing effects that bias has, right? So really this research started with these two women, and the real kind of inspiration of why I started writing this book was these two women. One's name was Ruth Horowitz, who was a very brand new developmentalist in a brand new kind of field. She was one of the first women to get her PhD in this out of Columbia. And then her research inspired the work of Mamie Clark. And so who got her PhD. She was the second Black woman to get her PhD out of Columbia. Her husband had been the first Black man. And he went on to really shape the Brown v. Board of Education. But it was really these two women who were really amazing. So one was a woman who was Jewish and was excluded from a lot of universities and a lot of access. And then one was a Black woman in a Jim Crow South out of Arkansas who went to Howard and then went to Columbia. And these two women kind of created a whole field of developmental science that allowed us to figure out, how do we ask kids about these really complicated questions? Like, how do we know what kids think about race when they're 4 years old? And it was inspiring to see. And so I read a lot of their work. And so seeing that they were going through all of this at a time in which women were often not allowed definitely not into graduate school, very rarely given access to things, in the middle of high rates of segregation. And these women got PhDs while having a child and kind of parenting, and were never given the careers that they were deserving of because people wouldn't hire them. But to realize that they really did, though, shape a field, but often didn't really kind of live to see that. And so I think that was really inspiring too, just to think these people really paved their own way, and we owe a big debt to them. I think as a society, because we know a lot about kids now, and they're the first ones that started asking it, like in the 30s. And that was really cool to see too, and just to look at old pictures of them and to think it's a shame that they didn't walk in a different era, because we would know their names if they'd had.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I've certainly never heard of them before. What were their names again?
So Ruth Horowitz was really the first one, and she got her PhD and was really kind of came up with this idea of you can show pictures to kids and then ask them questions about it, which has like shaped the entire field. So Ruth
Mm,
Horowitz, who her and her husband changed their names to Hartley later because there was so much anti-Semitism that they, as a family, changed their names. So Ruth Horowitz, and then Mamie Phipps Clark. She was really brilliant and was going to be a math major, but there was so much gender bias. So she was a Black woman raised in Arkansas, went to Howard, and switched into psychology because of the biases and sexism she was facing in math. And then met Kenneth Clark, and they married, and then she did her PhD, and it was inspired by Ruth Horowitz's. But because of the time, Kenneth Clark got most of the credit for it. And not because of his fault. He would say this was Mamie's work, but he got really famous. He was in magazines. He testified as part of the Supreme Court. He became the president of the American Psychological Association. And he would often give her credit, but she never really got an a research job. And so it was this interesting idea of these two women really, and I didn't know, I knew of Mamie Clark, but I had never heard of Ruth Horowitz until I started writing my last book. And I thought, how in the world have I never, like, I do research exactly like this woman does, and I've never heard of her. I was a full professor before I'd ever even learned of this woman's name. And I was like, that's just an atrocity. Like in my world, we're good at like citing people, and we say science is built on the work before others, and it's important to, give full references. And here's this person that started the work, and I literally had never heard of her. And it's because she couldn't get jobs. There's nepotism laws, like nepotism policies at universities. And so if they were married to another professor, the man would get hired, and they would say, we can't hire the wife because of nepotism policies. So the wives could never get jobs. And so it's one of those things where you see the bias affecting like the personal, but also the structural. And so it's this kind of meta conversation about the ways in bias affects kids, but also the people doing the research on the kids.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like completely interconnected, completely the
Yeah.
same system. Yeah.
Yeah. So I tried to tell stories of these women, give their like personal histories, because I thought, for one, they're just interesting. And these women are kind of amazing. And kind of the things that they did were, I think, really impressive. And we're going to spend some pages telling just their little biographies, because it, I think, also paints a bigger picture. I think you're muted. Are you talking to me?
I was muted. Thank you. So let me repeat myself. We're going to open things up to audience questions now. But while we're waiting to see if we get any audience questions, aside from your book, do you have any other resources that you could recommend to parents?
Yeah, I think there's some great websites out there that I think are really high quality and really useful. So I think when it comes to gender and gender identity and sexual orientation, welcomingschools.org is really good. They have lots of information, as does GLSEN, so it's GLSEN, Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network is what it stands for. So that's really great. And when it comes to gendered stuff, I think when it comes to race and ethnicity, it used to be called Teaching Tolerance, but they just changed it to learningforjustice.org. It's a branch of the Southern Poverty Law Center. They have lots of great resources for parents. So both of those have lots of great books and films and conversation starters. And then Embrace Race is another nonprofit that has really wonderful book list and recommendations, and lots of information for parents to talk about race and to kind of just be affirming. Um, and I think those are really good ones that I frequently go to and encourage people to go to, because I think they have again, like books are a great conversation starter too for parents that are like wanting to have these conversations but aren't really comfortable. And there's books for the whole age, obviously there's books for the whole age range, whether it be board books when they're little to, young adult novels. But to read them, I think lead to then good conversations. So it gives you like a point of conversation, as opposed to just like, let's bring this up out of the blue. So I think that they're also really useful for not only the representation part, but to help parents have an entry point. I find it's if you're kind of feeling trepidatious, I find that it'd be a really useful way to kind of start those conversations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. And there are like a great variety of picture books right now that you discuss most any topic under the sun. Yeah, it's pretty
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah. And I think there's great books too that just show diverse people, and you can just say, "Oh, look at how they look like this. That's great," and it not be really part of the plot, but it just shows. And I think it's useful for parents to kind of point it out, so to make sure that it doesn't fly under the radar of kids. But
Are you working on any other projects at the moment?
not right now. I'm just kind of talking about this book mostly, and doing the rest of my professor life that I kind of ignored while I was writing this book. So, it's one of those I try to, I teach about bias, and teach classes on that and try to shape the laws and policies in my own world. So I'm kind of trying to do that. We're also trying to do a study looking at sexual harassment in schools. So I do a lot of work looking at how schools can change their policies to help be more protective of the youth that are experiencing harassment there. So we're kind of getting that started, but I'm also kind of paying attention to the things that have been neglected while I was writing.
Oh, no, certainly. I mean, a book tour and teaching is definitely enough work for a single person.
Yes. And I
Yeah.
just became the associate dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I realized that it's kind of biased 24/7. But
Oh, yeah. Well, congratulations.
thanks. I was like, oh, then now I'm going to go talk about it. But this part, feels more hopeful because it's people that are wanting to make things better and actually have power because they have kids. I think that's where change comes, is with kids.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in the last few minutes that we have here, um, you already answered pretty much what you hope that readers will take away from this
Mhm.
book.
Mhm.
But are there just any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave our audience with?
I'm gonna say one thing that I haven't said already is that I think that to leave with is for people to get more involved in things like voting. I think what I've learned a lot from this is how much power, like city councils have, like school boards have. And I think often we forget how much like local judges, also often elected positions, how much power they have over our kids' lives. And we hear about like Supreme Court cases, but really it's things that happen at like the city council. And I was like, I think we just all have to get more engaged in all of it and like look into who's running in the city council, um, who's running to be, chief of police, if that's an elected position in your area. Who are the judges? Like spend a little bit of time, and now it's so easy to find that stuff online, but look into it and then go vote. I think we forget that that's a really important source of influence we have. And again, I think we often think about like the presidency, but it's like the local stuff. That's who decides how schools get funded. That's who decides what kind of textbooks get adopted. That's who decides what kind of police procedures go on in your community. All of those things that we care about really get decided at the local level, and those are all elected positions. So, like, we all get to show up for that. And that there's lots of ways that we can contribute in that way. And so, kind of getting more engaged and also the bigger picture. is, I think, another important part of it. It's one example I give in the book is our city council was considering putting a ban on conversion therapy, where you try to kind of make people not gay, I guess. There's clearly no evidence that it does anything good, and it does lots of harm. And the city council was wanting to kind of ban it in the city. And they they reached out and asked several of us if we would be willing to kind of write a statement about it. And so just spending time writing something and just kind of expressing our opinion. And so they had a lot of community members weigh in to say, yes, we think you should do this ban. This is good. So kind of being aware of like, what kind of things does the city council decide? Is there something that I think is actually important that I can weigh in on? And sure enough, the city council agreed and they banned it in the city. And so it's like little stuff that I think makes a difference, that I think we often get distracted by the big flashy kinds of politics and the big flashy kinds of policies and laws, but there's a lot that affects our kids' lives. That is, because for most kids, they go to public school. So kids' lives, for the majority of their lives, are dictated by city, state, federal policies. So that's one issue, is that laws determine kids' lives to a large degree, and funding and things like that. So that means there's a lot of times that we can really weigh in and make it better, or at least put people in place that we think have unbiased motives. I think you're muted again.
That's so funny. I am muted again. Well, I was just going to say thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. This was a wonderful conversation, very enlightening. And I love all the resources and the thoughts that you've left us with. Again, I think it's great to have like actionable things that people can use.
Yeah, well, thanks. You too.
Great. Well, I will leave links where y'all can get your own copy of Unraveling Bias down below. And I hope